Hey there, thanks a lot for joining me today. I am actually out of town, but I prepared this video to talk about using compression in an orchestral mix because I think there's certainly aspects of compression that trip up everybody, but particularly in orchestral music, I think I find myself using compression more as an artistic tool than just kind of a peak limiter. So I want to talk about the two functionalities that I use and hopefully expose you to, a different perspective on using compression in orchestral music specifically. So this video is really going to help you if you produce orchestral music and you want to be getting a better mix, you want your instruments to gel better, you want to have another artistic avenue for balancing your instruments. Or if you're just somebody who wants to understand the essential concepts behind what a compressor does, I think you'll get a lot out of this video as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually demonstrate in Cubase how the waveform changes when you apply a compressor. And I'm going to talk about sort of two contexts of using a compressor. One is just to limit peaks, where you are trying to smooth out the peaks in an audio, the extremes, to just kind of make things a bit more predictable. That's one context. The other context is where you're actually trying to reshape the envelope. You're trying to reshape the attack, or you're trying to reshape the decay or the sustain or the release of your sound. Now, if you don't know what an envelope is, I think you'll understand better once you see the demonstration I'm about to do. But the sort of very quick and dirty explanation of an envelope is that every sound has an attack, has a decay, a sustain, and a release. So a violin, for example, has usually a very long decay, a relatively long decay compared to, say, a snare drum, not decay, attack, compared to a snare drum where the attack is immediate. The attack is immediate, the decay is immediate, there's no sustain really on a snare, and the release is irrelevant because there really wasn't any sustain. Whereas a violin has generally a slow attack, a slower decay, if any at all. It sort of just goes straight into sustain, and then the decay is up to the player. I'm looking at a brass example in today's lesson, and we're going to be looking at how we could actually use a compressor to sort of put the horns section in the background and maintain some of the punch and character of the trombones, balancing the two so that the French horns sit more in the background and support the trombones, and the trombones are really kind of the loud and proud element. So let me take myself off screen and let's look first at a little demonstration here of some samples. Okay, so what I've got here is 3 samples. This is my original, and we'll just take a look at it. It's just a horn, very basic horn playing. It's pretty quiet, so I'm sorry if it is hard to hear. Let me actually just see if I can't bring all of these up a little bit. Excuse me. Just going to bring them all up a little bit. All right, that should be better. All right, so we've got 3 versions over here. We've got one where it's the original. We've got one where we're applying a compressor starting at -30 dB, and you'll understand that better in a few minutes. And then another example, it's a bit more extreme, where we're applying the compressor at 40. And let's just look at the original example here. I'm going to bring this up. I'm working in Cubase, and I'm just going to bring this up in my audio part editor down here. So you can kind of see that, excuse me, I've got something in my throat. But you can kind of see that the peak on this original sample we start to get peaks around this -30 to -26 range. These are decibels over here. So these start to look like, well, if I wanted to shave the tops off of this, I would want my compressor to kick in somewhere between -30 and -26. If I wanted to allow that peak through, then I wouldn't want my threshold to be set any lower than that. So let's talk about how I can control that by looking at the compressor for this channel. And I've got it over here on this monitor. Let's just bring it up. A couple of tips I have if you're working in Cubase and you want to enhance your workflow or optimize your workflow. First thing is using the channel settings is actually a really graceful way to apply EQ and compression and a lot of the basic effects, because you wind up working in a very similar workflow every time. It does speed things up, and the effects in here are great quality, so I think you'd be really happy with the result. So let's take a look at our compressor settings here and talk a little bit about what they are. So in a compressor, ratio is basically, if my ratio here is set 8:1, it means every decibel over the threshold that my audio signal travels, every 8 decibels over my threshold, which is right here, this compressor will allow the volume to go up by 1 decibel. Okay, so if my threshold here is set to -40, it means that if the level goes to -32, which is 8 decibels louder than -40, so if my peak reaches -32, then it's actually only going to allow this to go to -39, which is 1 decibel louder. So 8 decibels louder in the signal gets translated to 1 allowed decibel louder in the output from the processing. How quickly does the compressor jump on my sound and apply this ratio? That is what attack is. How quickly does it jump on the sound? Hold is after it's applied the attack, does it continue immediately recalculating based on, looking at the threshold and comparing the threshold to what is in the signal as the signal changes? Or am I going to actually just hold whatever the original reaction was for a period of time? I'm going to do that in this case because I'm demonstrating something visually that I think is easier to see when it has more extreme settings. Normally I wouldn't necessarily have a hold of a half a second like that. Release is how long does it take before once the audio goes below the threshold, how long does it take before the compressor actually completely stops working? That is what release is. Makeup and this auto makeup gain, you will see gain reduction, meaning that the compressor actually is making the sound quieter. That's what a compressor does. It compresses the level. But typically people will use some kind of auto makeup gain, or they'll actually gain it up and they'll get a louder signal. What auto makeup gain is going to do is it's going to figure out what the gain reduction is, which you'll see on the meter here. If the gain reduction is -6, then having auto makeup gain on, it's basically in the background going to bump up the signal by 6 dB because it knows it won't clip. That's how the compressor is working here. So I had 2 examples, one where this was at -30 and one where it's at -40. And what we see is that when we look at the -30 example versus -40, you can see a big difference down here. So if I layer these all together, you can actually see that the green one is -40. You can see how much more compressed it is, and it's really sort of just one long sustain. So you could think of this as having really reshaped the attack and decay of this sound while maintaining the sustain, right? So this approach has gotten a lot more sustain. Excuse me, I just have something in my throat that I need to get out. But the red signal here, this is mildly compressed. You can see that the peaks have been taken off a little bit, but it is also still got a lot more dynamic range, a lot more range dynamically than this very heavily compressed one. So the green one here is set at -40 threshold with an 8:1 ratio. The red one is, I think, set to -30 with an 8:1 ratio. And the yellow one in the background, that is just the original. So you can see how the compression has actually changed the contour and the envelope of my sound. So now how do we use this creatively is the next question. And the way that I think of using a compressor, it falls into two categories that I want to explain. The first type of use that I'll apply a compressor on is where something's basically the right level, but every now and then there's something jarring. And I will use a compressor to find out where that jarring level is. And then I will use the compressor to make sure that everything stays within a certain range. It's not always running in that case, right? So the compressor might only kick in from time to time. It's triggered by these extreme moments. And it's not really doing a lot of work other than to tame extremes. That's a very common application for a compressor, and it's a great way to use a compressor. I mean, if you want to avoid clipping, you've got a great track, except there's one, maybe there's a plosive in a singer's voice, or even on percussion, for some reason, the percussion was hit particularly hard, the rest of the take's fine. You can use a compressor to even that out. But what I'm really going to demonstrate in a few minutes is how you can use a compressor to actually make creative decisions. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I've got 4 horns and I've got 3 trombones, and I want to juxtapose them together. The originals, they sound good. This is coming from Berlin Brass, so it's a really good library. I'm very happy with it. I generally don't feel like I have to do a lot of mixing with these libraries. But right now they're kind of fighting with each other, right? So I've got a horn section and a trombone section, and they're both vying for first position. They're both vying for my attention to be the thing that I'm mainly listening to. And what I want to do creatively here, sort of from an artistic standpoint, is I want to put the horns in the background, and I want to let the trombones, and especially their sort of their more aggressive attack, their low brass feel, take center stage. So the way I'm going to do that is with a compressor. I'm actually going to even out, as we see down here in this example, the way that you can use a compressor to like really squash things and turn them more into a sustained instrument. I'm going to do that with my horns. And then with the trombones, I'm going to apply sort of really just peak compression so that it's a little bit tamed, and I don't have any extremes. I'm going to show you that. You're going to see waveforms that demonstrate how this is working. But it's still going to have all the character. There's not going to be a lot of reshaping of the trombone's natural dynamics. So let me take myself off the screen now, and we're going to look at just a little bit at how the session is set up. So I've got 4 horns here. These are all going to a horns bus, which is down here. I've also got a trombones bus, which is what these 3 trombones here are going to, okay? So when I listen to just the horns bus, I get this. Let me go back to the beginning. So you can hear that is very, it's a very sort of proud sound. Now the trombones sound like this. Now they both sound really good. I just want to tame them and organize them a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is on the horns bus here, one thing I'll point out about this project is I've actually created an audio track which is taking the input from the horns and it'll record it. And then the trombones here is taking the input here. So what we see down here is the audio that comes out of these buses. So I have my instruments up here, and they're getting sent to one of 2 buses, either horns or trombones. And then these 2 buses are feeding their outputs into these audio tracks so I can record them and demonstrate them for you. And after I did that, what I got was basically in my horns, I applied a very high ratio, 8:1. Let's take a look at the settings there. And they look like this. I guess actually the horns were 6:1. The attack is almost immediate. There's a 1/4 of a second hold, a release of 100 milliseconds, and the threshold is set to minus 24. Now, where did I get minus 24 from? Basically, what I did was I'm using track versions here so we can see a processed and compressed version. But in the unprocessed version here, if I open that up in my editor, we can see it here. What I basically did was I looked at, okay, where in my horns is there sort of, what's the average between the peaks and sort of the lower signals? What's the average? And I determined that that was around minus 24. So on my map here, that's somewhere around here. Let's actually, I think I can, there is a way to change the scale, I think. Let me come over here. There we go. Something that's a bit more visible, gives us a little more visibility into what we're doing. So you can see how minus 24 here is coming across like this. It's cutting off a lot of the peaks. It's going to make a much more consistent, sustained sound. All right, and that's what we see when I look at the horns post. This is post the processing. The unprocessed one has these peaks, but as you'll see that the compressed one is much more even. So let's just switch back and forth between those. So that's the uncompressed one, much more peaks. Here's the compressed one. So it's quite heavily compressed. Let's listen to the difference in the sound between these. I'm going to just mute or unmute, and so we can solo just this track. So this is the unprocessed bus from the horns. Quite bright and you know, at times quite aggressive. Now this is the processed compressed version. Much more mild and much more subdued, and that's going to sit in the background behind my trombones. That's what I'm doing there. Now let's look at the trombones. Trombones have a slightly more mild setup. The ratio now is 2.2 to 1, so much more mild. The attack, I'm letting 20 milliseconds of the initial attack for any sound coming out of the trombone to, I'm allowing it through before the compressor will even trigger, no matter what the threshold is. And then when the threshold is triggered, there's no hold and the release is very fast. So I'm really just trimming, cleaning the very top edges off. And you can see that when I look at the unprocessed. You can see that there are some rather extreme peaks here that are uncharacteristic. It's okay to just shave off the very tops, and that's what I'm trying to do here. I want to keep generally the character of the trombones, but just shave the very top peaks off. And so when I look at the compressed version here, you can see that now the peaks have largely been just sort of trimmed off, and it might even be easier just to see it in this version here. So I'm going to switch between, I'm looking at this waveform now, and if I switch between the unprocessed, you can see there's just a little bit more going on. So I just tamed it a very, very little bit. Okay, and so the effect now is that the horns sit in the background a lot more than they were before. They used to be sort of fighting with each other. So this is the final compressed outcome. The French horns are definitely more in the background, and the trombones are really taking the lead. Now, if we were to just go with the unprocessed original version, you'll hear how they both fight with each other. I mean, it's quite majestic sounding. It's not to say this is the only way to mix this, but they are fighting with each other, and I wanted to avoid that. So here is what it sounds like before the compression. There's a very big difference, especially in the horns, where the compressed version of the horns is a lot more tamed out. So let's listen to that just one more time. The trombones are clearly in the lead. So you can hear how the trombones are very clearly up front after that compression. So just to summarize, you want to look at the compressor first, certainly as a sort of peak controller, a way to make sure that nothing is going to clip. That's perfectly suitable and probably the most common use of a compressor. But hopefully coming out of this, you can actually understand how you can use a compressor to change the envelope of a sound. It's not exactly an envelope shaper. If you want some very, very specific control, look into using an envelope shaper, which is very closely related to a compressor in terms of how it actually works to either make attacks more punchy or to bring up the sustain of a sound. You can do that with other tools very precisely, but with a compressor, you can still have a lot of impact. One thing I will point out, because it was an important lesson for me that I learned many years ago about using a compressor from one of my mentors, is that in the very first, say, 10, 20 milliseconds of a sound, there's no matter what it is, if it's a clarinet or a snare or a kazoo, it doesn't matter. In the first 10, 15, 20 milliseconds of a sound, there's a lot of audio information which our ears, believe it or not, in that tiny frame of time, does compute and tells us a lot about the harmonic signature, the timbre of that instrument. And if you mess around with the first 10, 20 milliseconds of a sound, you can dramatically and by mistake wind up changing its tonal character quite a bit, because of course we mess up that first sort of fingerprint of its harmonic structure. Every sound, every timbre, the thing that makes a trumpet sound different than a recorder, it has to do with the harmonic series that comes off the fundamental pitch and what the amplitude or level of those harmonics are. And a synthesizer, I'm getting kind of off topic here, but it's really interesting. A synthesizer is essentially a tool for generating harmonics and then sculpting those harmonics to try to recreate something that sounds like a trumpet or a clarinet. That's the principle behind a synthesizer. So just be aware that you certainly can reshape the attack and decay of a sound with a compressor, and I've done that quite heavily here on the horns. And it's fine, it's still functioning well, but be aware that especially on things like with a very fast attack, like a piano, for example, when you mess around with that attack and decay, you're also messing around with the signature harmonic structure that our ears are listening for to determine what is that instrument. Is it a piano or is it a marimba? The way that our ears know that is oftentimes in a fingerprint that is conveyed to our ears and our brain in the first 20 milliseconds of a sound. So just be aware of that. Of course, people use compressors all the time to control attack, and it's just something to know about that can sometimes trip you up. I hope you got a lot out of this video. I will be back on Monday. I will be posting in the community tab a fresh week. I am now putting my schedule up for the live streams. I'm not in town today, which is why this video is pre-recorded, but I will be back live on Monday. If you have any questions about this video or you have suggestions for other mixing topics you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments. You can also post in the community tab on my channel's page. And I appreciate everybody's support. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Thanks. Bye.